that sadhana was about the celebration of life, not the denial of it. Your only task, your sole objective, he said, is to awaken the Devi within you. By whatever name you call her, in whatever form you find her. When you have fully awakened to her presence, your training with me will be complete. When I returned to Baba, who was a man of few words, he said to me, if you found her in the smallest particle, and as the force that moves the galaxies, how could she not reside in you? All you had to do is awaken her presence. Later he asked me, who is Narayani? And I responded, she is the supreme love. And that is who you are, he replied with a smile. When I was young, my grandfather told me that Devi Saraswati sat on the tongue of the poet. I looked at him skeptically, wondering why he thought I would fall for such a silly idea. How could a Devi be small enough to sit on a tongue? And if she did, why couldn't we see her? The very image sent me into swirls of laughter. Sometime later, my grandmother was working on a complex mathematical equation, and she happened to say that Saraswati was hidden in that equation. I thought, for sure, she's teasing me. How could the Devi be numbers? Dada was listening, and when he saw my confusion, he explained, she speaks to me through poetry, but she speaks to Dadi through the language of mathematics. The realization that the outer world is a projection of our own inner reality, inner world. And also the realization that when we experience anger or fear, and there's so much of that on the planet right now, or judgment, we are contributing to the collective shadows. And the more we can eradicate those negative elements within our own psyche, more we can eradicate fear and anger and judgment and greed, the more we add to the balancing of those negative shadows. So it gives us a sense of responsibility. So often we feel, what can I do to change things in the world? Actually, there's a lot we can do by elevating our own consciousness. Since I'm a writer, I thought that I would read a chapter from a book that I'm working on. The chapter is at the beginning of the book. It's called Finding the Devi Within, and it takes place in the future. The book is called Memories of a Future Life. I have written a lot about my past, memories of past births, but I decided to project myself into the future, 200 years, and to see what that future looked like. And one reason I've decided to do this is so many books and films about the future are dystopian, and that's not the future that I see. I see a more positive future. And so I wanted to project myself 200 years in the future. I'm born in a town in South India, and I'll begin reading from Finding the Devi Within. This involves the spiritual training that I undergo to awaken the cosmic mother within, as we all have her within. She is without and within, because the external world is but a projection of the inner. So the reading it would take me about 20, 30 minutes, and then I'll give my reflections on how this applies to my life today, and I'll open it up for questions. Chapter 3, Finding the Devi Within. When I was around 15 years old, my grandparents sent me to be trained by Baba, the wise elder in our town. In this life, I'm being brought up by my grandparents. Our education was such that at this age one could choose an area of study to delve into deeply, and Vedic wisdom was one of those subjects. My grandparents encouraged me in this direction from an early age, and they naturally directed me to Baba, a man I knew well, as he was a beloved figure to my family and to so many others. Although to most people he was known as a most kind and gentle man of great wisdom, with extensive knowledge of the Vedic sciences, he was also considered to be a consummate yogi, and I heard that some who went to him for training had to undergo the most difficult practices. So I didn't know what to expect. Would he engage me in studying ancient texts or subject me to esoteric yogic training? Either way, I expected a challenging path and submitted myself to his care with more than a little trepidation. I was to go to a small cottage as soon as I woke up in the morning and return only to my grandparents' home at the end of the day, whenever that might be. I suspected that sometimes this would mean not returning into the early morning hours, and I was prepared for that. Baba was somewhat eccentric, and one never knew what he would say or do. Sometimes he did the opposite of what one might expect. He paid little attention to what we might call comforts. He ate and slept little. So I was surprised when he told me on my first day of training that sadhana was about the celebration of life, not the denial of it. Your only task, your sole objective, he said, is to awaken the Devi within you. By whatever name you call her, in whatever form you find her. When you have fully awakened to her presence, your training with me will be complete. I didn't understand what he meant by the Devi within, because the Devi I knew was an external reality. I pondered the meaning of his words, but my logical thinking mind could not comprehend. And seeing the thread of my thoughts, Baba cast me a knowing smile, as if to say, "There's so much to discover." So I began. The name of the Devi I knew was Narayani, also known as Mahalakshmi. Since childhood, my grandparents had told me stories of her incarnation as Sita Ma, and through those stories, she became almost a living reality to me. My parents left the earth plane when I was still young, and it was Dadi who directed me to seek comfort in Sita, whom she called the mother of all. I would visualize her sitting beside me, drying my tears, embracing me with arms I could not see. Her comfort helped me in the years following the passing of my parents, but she then began to recede from my purview as my friends and studies brought me into the busyness of material life. My first thought now was to recall her, so I appealed to her to show herself to me once more. I soon came to know that none of the rigidities of harsh practice would be enforced, since Baba told me to set my own schedule and practice. My habit of meditation was already established, and when I arrived, I continued to meditate first thing in the morning, as I always had, but I added a midday and evening meditation. Since I was left on my own, in between meditations, I felt drawn to care for the small cottage and prepare Baba's meals. He didn't encourage or discourage me, but I saw there was a need to fulfill. As I cooked for him, I envisioned Sita by my side, directing me on how to prepare the meal, as I had no knowledge or talent for cooking. The more I served Baba in various small ways, the more I found her ever beside me. After I had been with Baba for several months, my grandmother asked me about the training. I told her how much I was meditating, and then I told her about the food preparation and how much I enjoyed it. She laughed, as she knew I had no interest in cooking. Then she smiled and replied, "It is she who is feeding him. She is working through you. That is why he allows it. Baba accepts no service from anyone except her." I often wondered if Sita's presence, which I had felt in childhood and felt again now, was not my imagination. But Dadi's words seemed to confirm what I had felt. The next day, when I entered Baba's cottage, out of the blue, he asked, "What is the imagination?" "I don't know, Baba. It is a question I've been asking myself." He chuckled. "It is intuitive knowing, something the rational mind knows nothing about. Do not question it, my dear. It is one of the great faculties that allows us to perceive what the mind cannot." That was all he would say. But upon hearing his words, my perception began to change. I knew that Sita's presence was real as anything. And I knew that when I spoke to her, I was not addressing a made up presence. And when she responded, that was as real as hearing my Baba's voice. In feeding Baba, I came to feel I was feeding the world. I understood now why Sita took such care to prepare meals for every guest. In doing so, she was feeding far more than their physical bodies, and she was feeding far more than those individual guests. Through the simple act of preparing food, she was nurturing all life and setting an example for all to follow. I began to see symbols in everything, manifestations of her nurturing quality, and I was beginning to awaken that quality in my own life. My understanding of Sita now expanded to her universal form of Narayani, and I began to perceive her everywhere. After morning meditation, it was my practice to take a walk, and as I did, I would see her opening the morning flowers. She was in the dewdrops that linger on the leaves in the day's first hour. She was the one keeping it all together, the dynamic force that held the universe together, preserving what had been created. I found her in the rotation of the seasons, in the blooming of life. I perceived her in the beautiful places, and she enabled me to find beauty in the places not so beautiful, in both the greenery and in fertile ground. Months passed, and my perception of her in the outer world deepened. When Baba saw this, he began sending me on special missions. One day he told me about a neighborhood child who was ill. "Bring this medicine to the child," he said. "The mother has to go to work, so stay with the child until she recovers." I took the medicine he prepared and went to the home, telling the mother that Baba had sent it. Relieved, she went off to work, and all day I spoon-fed the medicine to the young child, struggling for breath, keeping my mind on Narayani. To my amazement, as I fed the child, my sight opened, and I could see the inflamed cells of her lungs, and in those cells I saw her healing energy beginning to awaken, stimulating the immune system as it sought to calm down the inflammation. I could see her working within the body. It was beyond what my mind could understand, but I was perceiving not with my mind, but my heart. "It is she," I murmured, as I continued to feed the child medicine throughout the day, watching the internal inflammation decrease. By the time the mother came home, the child was much better, and her lungs were functioning normally. I returned to Baba, realizing that he sent me to deliver medicine so that I could find her presence even within the cell structure, performing the work of repair. It was an experience that greatly enlarged my vision, making me realize that she was in the tiniest subatomic particle. She was the mechanism for maintaining the structural formation of all that is. Months later, I had a dream in which I saw the universe in its grandeur, ever expanding to exceed all limits, and I perceived her hand sustaining it all, keeping the galaxies from colliding, the planets in their set orbit. She ordered the universe, both the inner and outer one, maintaining all existences, perpetuating life. I had seen her in the smallest particle, and now at the grandest scale, but I hadn't found her in myself. Baba began to send me on different kinds of missions. Two of your acquaintances had a bad argument and are not speaking to one another. Go and try to fix it, he told me one day. I knew these two girls never liked each other, and I was not close to either one, so I doubted I could do much about it. But I did as Baba commanded, speaking with each one separately, listening patiently as they accused the other of causing the problem. I had no judgment and no reaction to their bitter complaints. I was a neutral observer, but something in me arose that made me want to ease their burden and take away their anger. This became such a persistent urge, as if the two of them were my dearest sisters. After meeting with them separately a few times, I asked if they would meet together with me. Reluctantly, they agreed. As soon as the three of us arrived at the place of meeting, I sat aside so they could talk things out privately. Ignoring me, they began to argue. I listened to their harsh words without intervening, and then their words drifted away as a powerful force magnetically pulled me inward. My interiorization deepened, and all I could see or hear or know was Narayani. Her abounding love poured through every cell of my being, awakening a joy beyond expression. I don't know how long that lasted, but when I returned to normal awareness, I found those two girls laughing together. Whatever work was done, Narayani had done. When I got up to leave, they thanked me for giving them a chance to resolve their differences. It was your loving presence that really helped us, one of the girls said. It was her presence, not mine, I murmured to myself. When I returned to Baba, who was a man of few words, he said to me, if you found her in the smallest particle, and as the force that moves the galaxies, how could she not reside in you? All you had to do is awaken her presence. Later he asked me, who is Narayani? And I responded, she is the supreme love. And that is who you are, he replied with a smile. 3 years had passed since I began my training into Baba, and things were now beginning to shift. I stopped preparing his meals and began to spend more time alone in the neighboring forest, sometimes just staring at all the life around me. He didn't say anything about this change and seemed not to care that I was no longer preparing his meals. When I asked him about it, he replied with a chuckle, I enjoy seeing all the many ways she cares for me. Sometimes it is through food, and sometimes through other means. My mind was naturally begin to inquire about another manifestation of the great universal mother, Durga. I was curious about who this one was, who always appears ready for battle, with multiple arms bearing so many weapons. To me, she was just a concept, a symbol of courage and determination and the fight for justice. When I asked Baba whether she was just a universal principle, he chuckled and replied, she is a living reality, as you will soon come to know. When will I know her? I asked innocently. When you reach a breaking point, then she will come. His words sent a slight tremor through me. I had no interest in reaching a breaking point. Perhaps I didn't need to know Durgama. After all, Narayani was with me. A few weeks later, in the early evening, as I was about to leave for home, he asked me to stay and to spend the night meditating behind the cottage at the entrance to the forest, where he had created a small meditation area under an old majestic tree. "Stay until the light of dawn, and then you may come in," he requested. I didn't hesitate, even though we were in the rainy season and the sky looked ominous. I knew Baba never did anything without a purpose, so I went to the spot and sat to meditate. The hours passed, and the weather began to suddenly shift, disrupting the quiet of the night. Out of nowhere, fierce winds swept with howling force, loosening my hair, brushing it in every direction. It was difficult to concentrate, and I wondered if I should go inside. But remembering Baba's words, I decided to stay, determined to fulfill his request. Branches were now swaying back and forth, threatening to snap, arousing a fear that soon fully embraced me. A thundering crack ripped through the sky, followed by a cackling sound of a large branch as it came thumping down right beside me, practically touching me. I was so startled that I began to tremble, both from fear and the cold that now engulfed me. My mind told me it was unsafe to stay outside, and again my mind urged me to get up, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot. Frightening images emerged, rampaging through my mind as rain now pelted my body like small stones thrashing me, and I broke into relentless sobs. Anger now mingled with fear. Anger at Baba for sending me to what seemed a near certain death. Anger at the wind and the rain and everything around me. As my anger rose, the storm intensified, and I saw death staring me in the face. Just when I thought I could bear it no longer, the outer storm stirred an inner one, and my spine began to vibrate as it opened windows of time. They say that at the moment of death, one's whole life unscrolls before one. But now I was seeing innumerable deaths as the lid of memory lifted, revealing lifetime upon lifetime, traveling far back beyond the mind's horizon. In the course of time, what painful experience had I not endured? I had known them all: disease, loss, desperate poverty, all the ills as well as the good. Overcome by centuries of grief, my chest began to heave as I viewed millennia of lifetimes of different forms and names and personalities, culminating in the life I now had. I couldn't bear the weight of that past, entrapped in both an outer and inner storm. I reached a breaking point and cried out, "Durga Ma, free me! Free me! That is my only wish. Free me from fear. Free me from anger. Free me from desire, from everything that keeps me in this limited consciousness where emotional turmoil resides. Free me from my past and from all external conditions, all eventualities." It was then, and only then, when my cries became desperate enough, that she appeared. But not as I would have expected, not in a traditional mode, in traditional attire, wielding weapons from ages past. She was dressed as I would be, with streaming hair and glowing eyes, beautiful in her utter ferocity, holding in her hands a ball of radiant fire. I caught her gaze and stared into the depth of her endless eyes, where I encountered a most calming, soothing presence. In the midst of multiple storms of inner and outer turmoil, she was peace itself, and I felt as if I'd come home to rest. My tears and heaving disappeared as she gently tossed the flaming fire into my heart center, merging herself in my being. A great warmth engulfed me, making me immune to the outer winds and rain. I could no longer hear the thundering voice of the sky. There was quiet all around. My inner storm dissipated, and I watched as she discarded the burdens of my past. Stored memories of so many births melted away. I watched as she unhinged every thread that bound me, consuming my anger and fear, releasing me of shadows I didn't even know I possessed. In the late night hours, after I came to rest in a sea of calm, a brilliant full moon emerged, brightening and cleansing the darkened skies, chasing away the last remnants of fury. The calm of the night sky mirrored the calm that was now firmly established in me. Durga had awakened in me, and with that awakening came an outpouring of love. Love is who she is, and she made me realize that love is who I am. That night I stood at the edge of death, but I didn't die. Instead, I was reborn. At the first hint of dawn, I rose and went into the cottage, my clothing still dripping from the rain, but I was beaming with newly found energy. Baba was awaiting for me. You look radiant, my child, he exclaimed with smiling eyes as I entered. I see. You had an easy night of it. I gazed at him for a moment, and then I fell to the floor and rested my forehead at his feet. As I murmured, how grateful I am, Baba, how very grateful. That was all I could say because gratitude overwhelmed me. Quick, change quickly out of your wet clothing, then come eat the food I've prepared. That was all that was said that morning. My experience of Durga Devi did not end that night because I began to perceive her both at the grand universal scale and in the smallest subatomic particle, transmuting, evolving, destroying the old so the new can be born, helping stars to die so they can birth another. Without death, there is no birth. That night, a part of me, the leftovers from so many earlier births, had to die so that a deeper self could be born. Within myself, she had awakened at a time when I was most in need. The experience of that night set off a process of self-examination. I began to search every corner of my mind for unwanted emotions. Durga had begun the process, but I knew the work was mine to finish. I had to eradicate the roots of negative thoughts and emotions, which add fuel to the collective shadows that together we all create and that shape outer conditions. Little do we realize how the inner controls the outer. The world we know outside is but a reflection of the thoughts and emotions of so many people. My anger, my fear, my judgment, however slight, was adding to the outer disturbances, the unbalancing of the natural rhythms. Durga began to show me how my inner state reflected itself in the outer world. The more I held on to unwanted thoughts and emotions, the more she came back that they came back to me in the outer world. The world is just a mirror, I said to myself in surprise, as if I had just discovered an unknown truth. Our day-to-day life provides ample opportunities for these negative seeds to sprout. I became vigilant, lest the slightest word or action from someone or world event evoke a negative reaction that I might normally not even pay attention to. If even a slight, unwanted feeling appeared, perhaps untethered to any external event, I would see her hand rise and stamp it out. Durga Ma was standing guard, exposing the slightest rufflings in my mind, which I could not ignore. There was no escaping her, no way to evade her. She was on watch for the appearance, no matter how subtle, of any negative trait. I was glad for her presence, as I had called upon her to free me, to release me from unwanted emotions and reactions, and situations arose where I could practice the unwavering calm she had bestowed on me. Some tests I passed easily, others were more difficult. There was one in particular in which I had to struggle. There was no one dearer to me than my grandmother, my daddy, an acclaimed mathematician and astrophysicist. Many months after my night in the forest, she encountered a challenging incident. For years, she and her closest colleague, a dear friend, had been working together on a project that Daddy had initiated. But despite their best efforts, often working through the night, they achieved little success. They reached the point where they had to consider abandoning the project when unexpectedly, as they were working well past midnight, they achieved a significant breakthrough. Such a moment is a once in a lifetime event for a scientist, and naturally they were both thrilled. But then something went amiss, and the credit was all given to my grandmother's colleague, a younger woman whom she had mentored for years. It was not known whether this was intentional on the part of her colleague or some accidental occurrence, but my grandmother was crushed, believing her colleague had betrayed her. It was not credit she sought, but loyalty and fairness from this woman with whom she had worked for decades. She sank into a depression, something I never seen come over her before. The inner calm I had achieved was shattered, and I could not help but feel the urge to verbally attack this colleague. Every time I returned home, Daddy's condition would awaken in me this urge. And in my meditations, I entered endless arguments with her, demanding that she apologize and state the truth. This led me to a serious reflection on the acceptability of righteous anger, the righting of injustice, and I struggled with what to do. What was the right course? Finally, I took myself to the meditation seat at the edge of the forest where Durga had first awakened in me, and I asked to be shown the correct path. For hours, I sat quietly waiting for an answer, and finally it came from inside. How can you judge when you don't know the past, the causes and conditions that led to this situation? What will your anger resolve? These two competing sisters from the past have unresolved karma, which they alone can amend. It will work itself out, and both will grow through this experience. As I dove deeper into the interior world, I saw the seeds of their disharmony, their birth centuries ago in a family where competition was the central dynamic. This competitiveness had for so long been suppressed, but now it emerged so they could resolve it once and for all. I realized that this woman, Daddy's colleague, was not the cause of my anger. She was merely the external factor, stirring embers of anger which had not fully died. But the embers were mine, not hers, and she was not to blame. All outer conditions are there to awaken what lies within, what needs to be addressed within one's own self. To blame the outer is to avoid addressing the inner. Even though I recognized that the outer is a mirror of the inner, still I fell victim to the illusion of just judgment instead of accepting what is. That night when I went home, Daddy was already asleep, but Dada was awake and he appeared to be waiting for me. Until now, he had not commented on the situation at all. When I entered the room where he sat, he said to me, "Don't expend energy on this matter. Those two sisters will work it out. I would not get in the middle of them, and I have full faith in your daddy." It took many months for this situation to resolve itself, but it finally did, and in a most beautiful way. In the process, Dadi came into her own spiritual strength as soon as she let go of any attachment to any outcome, and she released all negative emotions. Her colleague entered a deep state of introspection and correction. They decided to peacefully divide the project and part ways, but it was through mutual agreement and a spirit of friendship. They resolved their karmic knot, and their partnership had served its purpose. There was nothing I could have done to resolve the situation. In its resolution, I saw the hand of both Durga and Narayani in the righting of an injustice and in the rebalancing and paying off of an old karmic debt. This experience confirmed for me the inutility of anger and judgment, and again it left me with such gratitude. To be free of those two was like putting down a huge burden, a weight I had carried for too long. When Adati returned to her normal, cheerful self, I asked her how this scientific breakthrough had come about after years of no progress. "How do you think?" she asked with a sly smile. I shook my head. "Saraswati, of course," she proclaimed. When I was young, my grandfather told me that Devi Saraswati sat on the tongue of the poet. I looked at him skeptically, wondering why he thought I would fall for such a silly idea. How could a Devi be small enough to sit on a tongue? And if she did, why couldn't we see her? The very image sent me into swirls of laughter. Some time later, my grandmother was working on a complex mathematical equation, and she happened to say that Saraswati was hidden in that equation. I thought, for sure, she's teasing me. How could the Davy be numbers? Dada was listening, and when he saw my confusion, he explained, "She speaks to me through poetry, but she speaks to Daddy through the language of mathematics." The whole universe, its very structure, is composed of mathematical equations and formulas. When Dottie looks into the night sky, she sees geometry everywhere and knows it to be the signpost of the divine. At those words, Dottie's eyes lit up in agreement, and nodding, she added, "Mathematics holds the key to the universe, and Saraswati is the one to reveal those keys." I didn't laugh at this thought, but I didn't understand it. After all, I was only a child, and I couldn't equate a Davy with a long, long list of numbers and complex signs. But as I grew older, this concept intrigued me. What was hidden in those equations, I wondered. The more I reflected, the more I realized that Saraswati must be active in every corner of life. Baba, ever so sensitive to my thoughts, tried to expand my vision of the Devi. She is the intuitive knowing that helps us solve problems. She is the innovator, the one who reveals new technologies. Every breakthrough is her work. She is the imaginal force that enables us to create and bring forth new enterprises, economics, finance, politics, social innovation. There is no aspect of life where she's not active because everything rests on the birth of new ideas, new ways of being. The universe is not a static one. It is constantly in the process of becoming. I nodded in agreement, but wondered how this applied to me. "You're too much in the mind, too conceptual," he chided with a slight frown. "You won't find her that way." "Then I must stay with you forever, Baba." He chuckled and replied, "Your time is nearly up." 10 years had passed since I first came to Baba for training. When I began, I was still a child, but now I was a young woman facing an unknown future. What would come after my time with him, I couldn't imagine. All my friends from childhood had found their calling in life and were entering various professions. Some were getting married. Everyone was fully engaged in so many activities, but I could not see a future for myself. I was embedded in the inner life and did not know my place in the external world and was unsure I could ever balance the two. I had no desire or interest in any one profession, and yet I knew my time with Baba was coming to an end. As he was saying this more often now, I had grown beyond the vision of Saraswati as only the creative power that inspires music and all the arts, architecture, dance, and every creative act. I understood her pure purview was much larger. I knew that her creative power pulses through the universe in an unending dance, a spiraling song without end. I knew that every second, new stars, new planets, new forms were coming into being. I knew that was her manifesting, but I couldn't find her within my being. How did she manifest in me? Concepts, concepts, said Baba to me one day with a shake of his head. Baba, I have no creative talent. How am I to find her within? I asked, annoyed that he was not providing me any direction. 2 years had passed since my mind had turned to her, and I was nowhere near to awakening Saraswati within me. You have breath, don't you? He responded in an equally annoyed tone. Who is it breathing through you? What has breath got to do with it? I mumbled as I left the cottage. But I didn't walk home. Instead, I went to the meditation area by the forest, determined to sit there until Saraswati showed herself. Focusing my mind, I called upon the will and resolve of Durga and her ability to cut through illusions. I called upon the strength and calming power of Lakshmi and her capacity to awaken the deepest spiritual resources, wisdom's wealth. I watched as my breath rose and fell, lulling me, guiding me to the inner sanctuary, to the place beyond breath. I observed the inflowing and outflowing air, and in doing so, I became acutely aware of that creative energy that enabled my body to be, that linked my consciousness to the physical form. And just as she sits on the tongue of the poet, I found her abiding in each incoming and outcoming flow of air. How many times in meditation I had watched the breath without finding her there. As I continued to meditate, I found her in the electrical currents spiraling through the inner centers of my spine, rising from the base to the beautiful lotus above, where I found her seated in the center of it all, at the core of my being. How many years had passed without my seeing what was most apparent? So often, what we seek is right before our eyes in the most obvious of places. And what could be closer to us than breath? That night, the subtle breeze of my breath carried her most soothing, humming tune. The light of the stars and the moon, her light, emanated from within, and the stillness of the mind was her speaking voice. I found her internally as worlds upon worlds revealed themselves. Far beyond the physical universe, she resides in the unseen worlds that murmur her presence. As the night passed, I lost track of time and space as I entered another reality. But soon enough, I was called back to the world of form, and I opened my eyes to find the first fingers of dawn climbing over the horizon. I rose from my seat, having fully resolved a dilemma I had struggled with for over a year. The creative energy that flowed through me and everything that is enabled me to imagine and perceive the next steps for myself, to lay out the path I would take. All mental blockages were now removed. Was it Durga who removed them, or Narayani, or Saraswati? How could I distinguish when I now knew them as one? Over the past year, I had dreaded leaving the safe harbor of my Baba, having no idea where to go or what to do. Now, with great enthusiasm, I embraced a future that she and I would create together, realizing that the Devi was with me as she always had been, blocked only by the restless, obstructive mind. The strength and piercing energy of Narayani, her beauty and balancing presence that maintains life, the will and determination of Durga, her ability to demolish all deceptive thoughts, and the creative impulse of Saraswati that flows through all things. My three Devis had become one, residing in the center of my being. She had become me, and I knew myself to be but a projection of her, inseparable. I returned to Baba's cottage that morning, knowing that my time to depart had arrived. I had realized what I had come to realize and was now ready to meet the world. And so the story goes on. That's chapter 3. As I wrote this, of course, I experienced it myself, and the realization that the outer world is a projection of our own inner reality, inner world. And also the realization that when we experience anger or fear, and there's so much of that on the planet right now, or judgment, we are contributing to the collective shadows. And the more we can eradicate those negative elements within our own psyche, more we can eradicate fear and anger and judgment and greed, the more we add to the balancing of those negative shadows. So it gives us a sense of responsibility. How often, so often, we feel, what can I do to change things in the world? Actually, there's a lot we can do by elevating our own consciousness, because then we elevate the vibrations. And we have to realize this takes place. I mean, we're a collective. The more we can help others eradicate their own shadows, the more we can clear the negative fear and anger and greed, which is rampant in the world. So that's our work. Our work, the more we do the inner work, the more the outer world will change. And in this writing of this book, part of my hope was to put forth a positive vision of a future that we're moving toward so that we can collectively create it. And so it's been probably the greatest challenge of my life to try to create that positive future, because we contend with so many elements, artificial intelligence, all kinds of things that are still unknown. But if we see the Devi active in all of these, I mean, we have to think, where are these technologies coming from? They're a gift. They're a gift, and it's up to us how we use them. So the more we can put us in a heart space, the more we can use them wisely. So we only have a little bit of time left. So I wanted to see if you had any comments or questions.
Just can't wait to read your next book. This one, and there's you mentioned that you're working on another one as well. So, and this exact thing I sometime back after finishing your previous book, I felt this exact thing, like, that like one identifies with you as one reads your books, and like gone through so much, so many lifetimes, so many uh births and deaths, and so many things in between. So it get tiring to be in this um, this wheel of uh, birth and death.
Does, and I think that the reason for the veil of forgetfulness, because if we, you know, carry these burdens, there can be a distraction. So we have to approach each life as if our only chance here. Although, of course, we want to learn the lessons quickly because there's a lot more that awaits us when we work through. I mean, the goal is to be free of returning from karmic compulsion. In other words, if we return to Earth, if we are reborn, it should be for the sake of uplifting humanity, for contributing to the good, not because we have karma to work out. We want to free ourselves from these entanglements. And we all know, which relationships are carried over from the past when we have work to do, what our aspirations are. We know what the things if we self-examination, I always think that meditation is half the battle. The other half is how we act in the world day to day, watching our mind and our thoughts and self-reflection, really observing ourselves because things can get very subtle. You can think, oh, I'm not a person of anger. I don't have much anger. I don't have much judgment. And then a slight little thing can awaken a judging thought or an anger, something that happens, either in your personal life or in the world. So many things are going on in the world. You can not, it's not easy to move beyond judging some of the terrible things that go on. And that's something that we all struggle with, and we all get opportunities to practice. And so for me, part of understanding it is to see it's part of a much larger picture. Everything has a previous cause. Nothing is accidental. So whatever's happening, it comes from a previous cause, and it's trying to work itself out. How can we assist that? By not reacting negatively. Having discernment is important. Discern what is adharmic. That's important. But to realize that everybody's working out their karma in their own way. Most people are creating new karma. You work out the old and you create new. So we don't want to create new situations for ourselves. And that's why I think it's important not just to see your past, but to think of your future. Because we want to clear the board and not create new karmic knots that we have to resolve at some future point. And so if we have troubled relationships, let's work them out now. I often say I had for many years had a very troubled relationship with my mother who didn't understand my spiritual aspirations. And at a certain point I said, I'm going to work it out now so I don't have to work it out in the future. And I put a lot of effort into working at that relationship, which we did in a very beautiful way toward the end of her life. But but so often we push aside things that are troublesome that we don't want to look at. And we have to know that if we don't resolve them now, we'll have to resolve them in the future. So I think more now about the future than I do at the past, because it's up to us collectively to create the future for our collective selves. It's nobody creates it for us. We create it. So we want to create our own personal future and a collective one for all of our fellow beings on this planet.
Right. Makes a lot of sense.
So I'm working on two books now, and it's interesting. I go back and forth them. I've been working on this book, Memories of a Future Life, for quite some time. Well, I guess not quite a year yet. But in the middle of it, I paused and began working on a book called Sita's Yoga. And I felt very strongly something was coming through that needed to be said. And it was the teachings of Sita, as opposed to just the external facts of her life. It was her teachings. And I found as I was writing that book, Sita's Yoga, that each chapter I was writing, I was having a challenge in my life that I had to implement those teachings.
Wow.
So there's one chapter called the Yoga of Non-Reaction. How can we come to a place of not reacting? and there were situations in the external world that I was reacting to. And so I was sort of like sitting at her feet and hearing those teachings and trying to apply them in my own life now. But the story, of course, all my books are told through stories. So the story goes back in time to Sita's time when she was giving teachings while she was living in the forest after the return from Lanka to various village people. In the untold story of Sita, there's one book about, the killing of a tiger, the situation between a villager and the tiger. Well, there are more stories like that of things that were happening at that time, where she gives the teachings that are completely applicable to our lives today, because the teachings are universal for all time, for all places.
Right.
That book will come out first because it will be a shorter book.
So
Sometime 2025. That's my hope. With Saraswati Ma's blessing.
Yeah, namaste, Dena ma'am. I trust you are doing good. I would like to know, it was a great evening listening to your upcoming stories. Thank you for that. Thank you for your time. I would like to know, it's just my curiosity to understand, like, how can we channel the great energies around us?
How can we channel? Huh? I don't know the answer to that. People often ask me how I write, and I can't say how I write. I'm a scribe. I'm like the secretary that's just recording. Uh, uh, and I think all one can do, I mean, we can attune ourselves with the Devi through meditation and through keeping the Devi, whichever form you feel closest to. I mean, it's interesting because in my past, I've had relationships, obviously the strongest with Narayani, but also with Durga and Saraswati. So in my future, those are the three that sort of come together for me. But I think that aligning yourself with whatever energy is you feel at that moment or in your life, that at this time in your life, and keeping the Devi with you as a living presence. I mean, that's most important to me. To me, Sita is not just an historical figure or this cosmic reality, but a living presence in my life. And it's I think the more you awaken your internal life, which comes about through meditation and self-reflection and reading topics about spiritual topics, the more you awaken that inner life, the more you find their presence within you. It's awakening yourself. We live so much in the external world, and that's a big distraction. We have an internal reality too, and there's so much to be said about that subject. I can't go into it now, but uh, uh, I keep thinking, I don't know what my next book will be. After I write about the future, whatever, I'd like to write a book about the subtle realms that takes place not in the physical realm, but in the subtle realm, because that's a whole reality of which we are a part. We exist in that reality as well. We're not in touch with that part of ourselves. And the more we awaken, the more we get in touch with ourselves as existing in other places as well. That may sound complicated, and there's too much to say about that. I can't fit it into a few minutes. But in terms of channeling, just trying to align yourself, awaken that living presence. It's like, what did she do? Cooked with Sita. She walked with Sita. She saw Sita everywhere. I do that as well. At different moments, sometimes it's a Durga with me at different times in my life, and often, and I've been writing more, Saraswati's presence. Different forms of that one cosmic reality that come for to fill specific needs. So I think it's just a matter of keeping the presence in your mind, keeping your mind on that presence.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dena ma'am.
Is there another question?
Namaste, ma'am. Yeah, please tell me how to uncover the past lives and unlock the past life memories.
That's also a question I don't know. They came to me organically in meditation, often through I have the book that I describe this in is another book, my first book, called My Journey Through Time. And it talks about how these memories came to me. I would meet a person from my past, and it would just stimulate memories in me. And then in meditation, the scenes would come forward, and I would see the whole narrative of that life. And then that person would exit my life, move away, and someone else would come in my life. This is truly what happened. And that would awaken a whole series of memories. And so I was able to go back sequentially. But I don't think it's important to do that, and I think one should only if it comes organically. You can find out through introspection a lot about your past, not the specific details, about people that you know, people that you've known before. I think if it doesn't happen organically, then it's not necessary. I think sometimes it happened to me so that I can sort of be living proof that this is the way it is. When I first published my book, My Journey Through Time, people here in the West thought I was going to be heavily criticized, that I was going to be looked upon as some kook. But what I found is that a lot of people in the West have snippets of memories. I knew that person before, something like that. And so it's much more widely accepted here now. And I think that there will come a time where it will be just broadly accepted, that scientists will accept it, because there's been a lot of research now that this is the way it is. And it will, there's something called the hundredth monkey. If 100 monkeys gain a certain skill, the whole species gain it. The more people who remember, it might become more common in the future as we move into a higher age, more common for people to have these memories. But the danger is they could be distractions. In my book, I talk about the memories of my previous birth came forward. It was very emotional for me, very emotional. I had a hard time making my way through it. And I had to function in a job and raising kids, and I was trapped in these memories. And so I don't advise it if it doesn't come naturally.